I want to refute one of the strongest, at least emotionally, one of the strongest arguments against the existence of God in this video, and that is the problem of evil. This is a very old problem for theists to contend with, and if you haven't heard it, it basically goes like this. If God is all-powerful and all-loving, then why does evil and suffering exist in the world? And emotionally, I think it's very powerful, and it's the one that causes a lot of people to doubt. In your own life, if you are a religious person, even if you're not, you might think in moments of despair, why is God allowing this to happen? If he loves me and he's all powerful, why is he not just preventing this thing? And I'm going to make this argument as strong as possible. I'm going to say, look at cases in which young children suffer seemingly pointlessly with these horrendous diseases. Why is God allowing children to die from, I think there's a video of Stephen Fry when he says, why is God allowing this horrible parasite to bore into the eyes of children? Why did he create this thing? What was the need for that? What was the purpose of that? And this is a very powerful emotional argument. But I think we need to separate the emotional argument from the logical argument, because really what philosophers who use this argument are saying is that this is actually a defeater of God's attributes. If God is all-powerful and all-loving, then that kind of God is logically inconsistent with a world in which there is evil and suffering. That's the argument that they're making, that they're actually trying to disprove God's existence. Really, they can't actually disprove his existence. They would just have to they could only disprove with this argument the coexistence of those two attributes. So if God, they're saying if suffering and evil exists, then God is either not all loving, but he's all powerful. He just, he's all powerful. He could do something about it, but he doesn't care. Or he's all loving, but he's impotent. He can't change things. Or they say he just doesn't exist. So let's address the logical problem, which is that it contains a hidden assumption, this argument, and I think that assumption is best laid out by simply saying, if God is all-powerful and all-loving, then he would remove all suffering and evil. And that is an assumption. And I would just ask this back. Why is it prove to me that it is the case that if God exists and he's all-loving and all-powerful, prove to me that he would remove all suffering and evil? Why is it the case that God would have to do those things if he were to be all-loving and all-powerful? And you might say, well, isn't it obvious? Surely if someone were all-powerful and all-loving, the most loving thing to do, that he would clearly do because he's all-powerful, is to remove suffering and evil. And I would have to completely disagree with that. Now, this argument has fallen apart for philosophers. It has been abandoned by serious philosophers. It goes around all the time, and it is the argument that we hear very often from atheists online, and it is a problem which we have to all confront in our daily lives, which is why it's still so powerful. But if you actually look to the, to expert academics, philosophers on this subject, atheist philosophers have abandoned this argument because it fails logically, because it makes these assumptions that cannot be proven, like the one I just laid out. And I just want to do a thought experiment to kind of show you why I think it's very likely that God has good reasons for allowing suffering and evil. Now let's just go with that assumption. It was, if God is all powerful and all good, all loving, he would remove all suffering and evil. So let's have a look at a world. Let's imagine a world in which God does remove all suffering and evil. Now let's start with, let's say God creates a world in which there is suffering and evil as we know it, and the people complain and they say, why are you allowing these terrible murders and genocides and so on? So God removes the genocides and the murders. That can never happen again. Those things can never happen. When someone goes to kill someone with a machete, the machete turns into a marshmallow. When someone fires a gun, a little sprinkling of dust comes out the end instead of a bullet. God intervenes all the time so that people do not murder each other. He prevents genocide. He prevents these great evils. Okay, fine, we've got that world now. Then people complain about natural disasters, and they say, God, remove these natural disasters. So he stops hurricanes, he stops volcanoes, and so on. Then we're getting into lesser evils and sufferings, and God removes those as well because the people complain about them. And eventually we get to a state where the only complaints people have in life are like stubbing their toes or trapping their fingers in the car door. And so those are now the greatest evils. These are the immense injustices in the world. Every time someone stubs their toe, it's an outcry. And so God removes all of these things as well. And then, once all suffering, all evil, any kind of suffering is removed, because this is consistent with the argument that's made, if God is all loving and all powerful, he should remove all suffering. God has now removed all suffering. What does that world look like? That would have to be, by definition, I think, a world in which everyone is only ever experiencing maximum pleasure. Pleasure of some kind, at least. Not even boredom, right? Because boredom is a kind of suffering. If you're in between moments of pleasure, that would now be the new category of maximal suffering. I don't know what to do with my time, I'm just so bored. This is such terrible suffering for me. And in a world like that, where there is no suffering, where people are basically on soma, right? They're pleased all of the time. Would anyone ever even think about God? Would anyone even question his existence? Would anyone ever reach for him? Now let's think about the theistic worldview or the Christian worldview. If God exists on that worldview, right? If God does exist, then what would be the greatest world, the best world? The best world will probably be, I think it's fair to say, the world in which the greatest number of humans freely choose to come to him and be saved. And so that's God's standard of goodness. Now, in a world in which there is no suffering and evil, I think it's quite easy to see that no one would be saved, in fact. If no one is ever experiencing any suffering, any problems in life, it's just pleasure all of the time, why would they ever need God? Why would they ever even think about God? There would be no reason. They would be just stupefied, zombified people, never thinking beyond their own pleasure. And if you think about your own life, the problem of evil is the reason people think about God the most, which is why it's such a strong argument, emotionally speaking. And it is kind of interesting that one of the strongest arguments that people use emotionally against God is the very thing which gets people to think about God to begin with. All of the times in your life where you really think about God, you're thinking, why God? Why did you allow this to exist? Those moments of evil and suffering and hardship are the very things, the very moments where we are called to question, to think about him. Those things bring us out of ourselves, so to speak. They make us think about the purpose of the universe, purpose of our own lives. We were born and we're going to die. They make us think about our own mortality, the point of everything. And so I think that suffering and evil are necessary for human salvation. I think that they're necessary for us to improve ourselves, to become better people, to think about God. And I just think that it is quite clear to see that a world in which there is no suffering and evil would clearly be a worse world if God exists. And we have to, we're thinking in the hypothetical here. If God exists, why does he allow this? Well, if God exists, at least the Christian God that I understand, if he exists, then I think he has perfectly good reasons to allow suffering and evil. And I would like to remind you that oftentimes we don't understand why God might allow something to happen. But would we actually expect to understand? And I think that we should really be careful of We should not let our lack of understanding of what God is planning undermine our faith, undermine our trust in him. That's really what I would like us to take away from this. So God, in allowing evil, in allowing suffering, has actually given us the most readily available means by which every one of us can know of his existence even. Beyond simply observing his creation, he has given us an internal way of knowing that he exists. When we experience evil and suffering, we're thinking about justice and morality. These are ways in which we can be called to understand his existence, to at least know of his existence. And in experiencing suffering and evil, every man can either curse God and reject him for these things and say that he must not exist, or if he does exist, he's evil. Or he can choose to bear his own cross. Think about this. If the Christian perspective is real, not only does God have good reasons for these things, but God has actually himself suffered more than anyone else, and he did so willingly. That's what the Passion story is. God came to earth in the flesh and was the perfect man, a good man, an innocent man. He was betrayed by one of his followers. He was persecuted, died on the cross, killed, humiliated, and died and was resurrected, and he died for all of our sins. I don't think anyone could really be said has suffered more greatly than that. He bore all of mankind's sins. So, on the Christian worldview, God has already suffered for all of us, and he's just asking us to bear our own cross. So this is now your choice, really. You either see evil, you see suffering, and you curse God, and you say, "Why have you done this? I reject you." Or you say, you understand that God has already made a sacrifice for you, and you say that you're willing to bear your own cross. And I think that is what God calls every person to do. And in allowing suffering and evil to exist in the world, he has given us a means by which we can easily experience him. That is part of his plan for the greatest possible human salvation, of people willingly coming to him. So I think when you look into this, you really see that the problem of evil is no problem at all. In fact, God's allowing of suffering and evil is really fundamental to the greatest of plans, to the best possible world. I think it's easy to understand that this world, which is a possible world, is the best possible world, exactly because of the suffering and evil which has been allowed to exist. And when you compare that with a world in which there is no suffering and no evil, where everyone is just in a permanent state of stupefying pleasure, there's really no contest.